Well, a very good evening, everybody. Welcome to another of the Bronze Lectures, this time on human factors. Hopefully you can all see the correct screen and that it's the full screen version. You should be able to see everything there. Everything should be ready to go, and hopefully you can hear me too. But yeah, thank you for joining me this evening. So another topic, an interesting one, this, and one that has developed a lot over the last few years, especially with the introduction of crew resource management and things within the gliding community. So quite a lot to cover this evening. As always, you can use the Q&A button on your screen to raise a question. Ideally leave them to the end, but if it's something really pressing, then pop up. We'll try not to go too much off a tangent, and it should last about an hour. I can see there's a good dozen of you in today. So what are we going to cover? We're going to cover a huge amount of things, from sort of the regulatory side of medicals to various conditions that you might get while flying, such as hypoxia, hyperventilation. We'll also look at some behavioural characteristics, a little bit about the body. As I said, I'm not a doctor, I'm very much a flying instructor. Oh, got a Q&A. Oh, okay, thank you. I'll just make sure that we're on the right screen. Just double check that is. Michael, so can you see at the moment, are you seeing smaller screens at the moment? Are you seeing two, are you? I probably assume that's what's happening. I can go to another screen to make that happen. You're probably seeing my cheat screen. Okay, let's see what we can do. Let's check that we're on that one. Okay. I think, yep, now okay. Okay, fantastic. I might have to go to the other screen briefly to bring up my notes if need be. But okay, so yeah, a lot of things to cover, and we'll make a start. So, fitness to fly. Whenever we go fly, we need to make sure that we are in the right mental state, in the right physical states, as well as following some rules. So, first of all, age. Well, we all know that the minimum age to fly a glider solo is 14 in the UK. There's no actual maximum age, and there's a good reason for that. It's because everybody's slightly different. It's down to the individual and the club CFI within the VGA to decide when somebody should stop flying. Generally, most people come to the same conclusion at the same time as the club does. But a degree of maturity is needed, and obviously clear thought processes are required as well. Medicals, which we'll come on to in a moment, you need to be obviously fit to fly. If you've had surgery or anything major has happened, if you've had a long stay in hospital, the fact that you've got a medical, that medical will probably be suspended until such time you speak to your aeromedical examiner or doctor to make sure that you are safe to operate machinery such as aeroplanes again. At the moment, we can operate on driving licenses. So pretty much if you can drive your car, you can fly your aeroplane as well. But again, if something does, if you do have a stay in hospital, even if you, let's say, have your appendix out, you really should make sure that you are signed off and everything's complete, and have a chat to somebody who's in the know. You can obviously come to us to check things, but again, I'm not a doctor, neither is Colin. We can get in touch with medical advisors, but very much the case is we leave it to you to sort your own medical out, and then we just take the paperwork afterwards. So EU license at the moment is fine, use that. We just take a photocopy. LAPL license is a certification mostly by GPs. You can get it done by an aeromedical examiner, but it's slightly more expensive. The sailplane pilot license, of course, we're now moving to a stage where we've got the same, just the one license now, the sailplane license, which can be, the privileges are either determined by the medical. So if you have a lesser medical, the LAPL medical, you cannot operate commercially. The SPL allows you to operate commercially and is also ICAO compliant. That means that you can take your license anywhere in the world and it will be recognised. The only sort of commercial operations that happen with sailplanes or gliders are generally either in America or potentially if you're doing something like my job. So yeah, we operate in class 2 medicals. We're not as stringent as the commercial world, which has class 1, which is a yearly test and very expensive. But again, the class 2 can only be done by an aeromedical examiner. and it is your responsibility to check that's valid and make sure you're fit to fly. The insurance company will, in an accident, will always be checking to make sure that you were licensed and medically fit to fly, and may refuse to pay out if you have an accident, even if it's a minor one, if your medical's not up to date. Physical well-being, I say this, if I bring up my pen, this chart really, really useful. Sort of, I said illness, if you're on drowsy medication, we'll come on to that later, but making sure you're fit to fly. Very much at the moment, you should not be turning up to Lasham even really with a minor cold. It will really, really put people off. And if you're displaying any coronavirus symptoms, yeah, you're going to get in big trouble. So certainly with illness medication, stress, if you're going through divorce or a house move or things like that, then make sure that you're in the right frame of mind and that you're not trying to do too much. Flying can always wait for when you're feeling better. Alcohol, we'll come on to that, but making sure you've not been binge drinking. Fatigue, obviously, making sure you've slept enough, and eating. So you've got to make sure that you've got enough nutrients, and not always just drinking water, making sure you've got electrolytes and things like that to sort of stimulate the body and keep it working. And comfortable. We've got to use the right cushions and stuff like that, ones that are approved, and we'll make sure that you, if you have a hard landing, it doesn't hurt you, but making sure we're comfortable. Nothing worse than having an ill-fitting parachute or something like that. Okay, a bit of a sort of information overload on the screen at the moment, and this is available on the CAA websites, but you can have a look. You can see the different types of medicals that are sort of around. Ignore these ones to the right, the UK Class 1 and European Class 3. That's for air traffic controllers. That is sort of national licensing. We won't go into that. It doesn't really affect us. Anything right or left of here is sort of important. And it's these columns in particular that are the ones that you're looking for. So the Class 2, for example, so I have a Class 2, it's every 5 years I go for that. When I get to 40, it's every 2 years, and after 50, it's a year. When you're crossing over those lines, you have to make sure that you double check if you're going from 40 to 50, etc., that medical is still valid, because they will expire at different times. And you can see the LAPL is a little bit easier, and the Declaration of Health. And similarly for like driving using a driving license, you need to double check that that's obviously valid. I understand that you have to renew it at some point, so make sure it is still valid. I know a couple of people who've gone through that process, but I'm a little bit young to know what that is. But there's the information. Sometimes you'll need an electrocardiogram, which checks to see how your heart is working and your body is working, and there's sometimes audiograms, but that's only generally for instrument rating. I don't think you need that for cloud flying rating, and anything else. So yeah, make sure you're medically fit. Once it's out of the way, then most of that's sorted. So the atmosphere, most of it comprises of nitrogen, 78%. You've got 21% oxygen, 1% which is made up of plenty of other gases. And if I look at my other screen, I'll have some more information. So the air thins with the altitude, but the percentages of all gases remain the same. And generally we think of air pressure falling at 30 feet per millibar. I think that's the right way. Yes, 30 feet per millibar. But when we talk about what we're using here, oxygen is obviously the most important thing to us, and we need to make sure that as we do get higher, which we're going to look at, that we've got the sufficient supply of oxygen. These percentages do not change as you get higher, but obviously the amounts of them do change. So yeah, you need to make sure you've got enough of that. I think that the rest of that is just talk about where carbon dioxide comes from. We'll come on to nitrogen and the bends, but just some key figures. They do sometimes test that in the exam to check, and it's a useful thing I remember learning from physics. So that's what the atmosphere is made up of, is those percentages. So a diagram on how the human body works. Again, we'll go to our notes on this, because I'm not a doctor. So we do have to have some knowledge of the human body to the right one. Yeah, we need to have some knowledge of the human body in order to understand the limits of the performance of the human. So you can see the circulatory system, how the air comes in and it gets absorbed into the air and into the bloodstream, goes through the heart, goes out into the organs, various bits and bobs that it has to go through to make sure it all works. And you've got red and white blood cells, which the red cells are iron rich, so they're supposed to take hemoglobin and take oxygen all around the body. The white cells are the ones that attack any issues that you may have, fix any wounds and stuff like that. And it's also suspended in blood plasma. The heart's general pump, and it's about the size of your fist, with 2 chambers. It's connected by a series of blood vessels, arteries and veins, and the heart contracts, forcing blood through one way, valves to the arteries, and this pressure is obviously felt through the heartbeat. But yeah, you won't get a question on how to label it, but just something to sort of set the scene of what we're looking at and how the sort of plumbing works inside. So not my strongest area. That's why I didn't become a doctor. But yeah. Respiration, obviously talking a little bit more about how the air sort of gets around and how the blood moves around the body. And again, fairly similar. In through the lungs, that gets diffused and it goes into the bloodstream, through the heart, and it gets burned in the body cells, back round, through the carbon dioxide comes out, and back out that we exhale. But conditions where this might become more interesting for us pilots than wanting to just do general physiology is stuff like hypoxia. So where we get a lack of sufficient oxygen for the body. Now we might see this when we're actually going wave soaring. So perhaps you've come on the Avoyne expedition and you want to do dive and height. Normally you're having to do a height gain of about 20,000 feet or so from the ground, because you're going to take a relatively high aerotow, maybe 4,000 feet, and then you've got a 5,000 meter height gain to do. We carry oxygen in the gliders, and the oxygen systems are tested and have to be fully serviceable to go flying, but you could have a failure. And if you do get hypoxic, where you don't have enough oxygen to meet the needs of the body, the scary thing is that you won't often notice that quickly. When I've flown around the 10 to 11,000 foot mark in the UK and Australia, I found that you get a headache, but you don't really notice too much else. I've not dared go above that altitude with oxygen, A, because it's not really legal, and B, because it's not particularly good for your future health either. But the scary thing, what can happen is that you get a personality change, where effectively you just become a bit gung-ho. You don't really notice and you don't really make sensible decisions anymore. And they test it on sort of, I understand, fighter pilots, they get them to sort of do maths in a chamber, in a decompression chamber, to sort of see how the mental load sort of increases without you knowing. So you can barely do basic sums. So common sense does diminish. And it's not like being drunk. It's you have some sort of awareness, but you don't really have any rational awareness that you might do normally. Reactions are slower. You might feel a lot weaker, and you might not be looking out as much either. When on a busy wave day up in Scotland, you might have 20 or 30 other gliders up there with you, and that's not the place you want to be. We'll come on to smoking a bit later, but obviously if you're smoking and you're getting lots of carbon monoxide in you and you're ruining your lungs, that's not going to do particularly well for being able to operate at high altitude if the system fails. And unlike the sort of systems that the fast jets use at high altitude, the glider stuff is not really to the same degree of reliability. So we have to be very, very careful. Very rarely does anybody operate in the UK above 25,000 feet, but that's still relatively high. And if you think that's still potentially a good half an hour to come down from that height. With the EASA, you are supposed to carry oxygen if you're operating above 10,000 feet. There used to be sort of rules saying if you operate between 10 and 12, you can do it for half an hour, but ideally have oxygen. Some people have it from 8,000 feet because they know that it will just keep the brain working a bit better. If the oxygen systems that we use up in Scotland have alarms which say if they're running out or if there's a battery issue or something. And the main thing is if you're really high, you need to pull the air brakes and set the aircraft up in a fairly stable attitude, because you might for a little while not actually be able to fly the aeroplane very well. There's been a couple of times in history where gliders have climbed really high, potentially a bit faster than people expected, and the oxygen systems failed. There was an accident, I believe, of a Geodiscus, where the pilots got up to about 30,000 feet. The oxygen failed. They'd set it up in the dive. The aircraft wasn't properly trimmed though, because when they woke up at about 12,000 feet, the glider was doing about 180 knots and the wingtips had come off. And I believe they did actually have to jump out at the end. So yeah, make sure if you're going to go that high, make sure your oxygen kit's working and that you've got a plan B. A mate of mine did a very good diagram of this just to look at what happens to the atmosphere. As I said, the air pressure reduces, the air density reduces, the amount of proportion of oxygen remains the same, but up to 10,000 feet, we can just accept that it's going to be enough generally, unless you're in a vulnerable category, and that's we wouldn't want to go wave soaring generally in those conditions. So ground to 10,000 feet, you can breathe normally. Generally, with what we're doing, we're operating in here. Oxygen must be added to the air supply between these altitudes. Really, above 30,000 feet, that would be a little bit scary if we're just using very sort of rudimentary gliding kits to do that. Above that height is 100% oxygen. A baby Grob has been up to about 40-something thousand feet on very specialist kits. I wouldn't necessarily want to do that. We've got the Perlan 2 glider, which is developed by Airbus, which goes all the way to 100,000 feet. They're trying to get to. That's fully pressurized and wanting to use some of the very powerful waves that happen down in South America. But yeah, you need to make sure that you've got the adequate oxygen supply. Because it goes, time of useful consciousness does vary, and it depends how much stuff you're doing. If it's a high workload environment, from 22,000 feet, you might have 5 minutes. If you're stressing out a bit and hyperventilating and whatnot, you will have even shorter. But yeah, 5 minutes is something you might have if you have an oxygen failure. Now, how much time does it take to get down to 10,000 feet? Well, 1,000 feet per minute in a glider, that's a fairly steep descent. We could go more than that. But at the same time, you've got to be kind to your ears as well. That wouldn't particularly feel particularly good if you're up at that height descending at 5,000 feet a minute. Plus, you also need to remember the glider's VNE, its maximum speed is lower, as well. So if you're just sitting doing nothing and very chill about it, which I wouldn't be, 10 minutes is the amount of time that you would have from 20,000 feet. But you can see how it varies up here, where I think once, twice you might get a glider. You do not have long. So yeah, we generally don't operate our club gliders above 24,000 feet. Hyperventilation. So this is where we breathe a little bit too much, get a bit sort of worked up, let's say. And generally, this is caused by anxiety. Maybe you've had a near miss with an airliner or something scary like that. And you need to be able to calm down and control yourself, because you're going to start getting dizziness. You're going to start feeling like you can't operate the airplane because it's all tingly. You're just going to lose your normal senses and sort of rational ability to fly the airplane. So don't get the two confused, because they can be slight sort of similarities. And obviously you don't want to be hyperventilating in a hypoxic situation, because that will sort of reduce the amount of time you have of useful consciousness. But because of the amount of carbon dioxide that is produced and will remain in the system a little bit more, we need to do something to cure this. You can, in the typical movie fashion, use a paper bag or cupped hands remember, you've still got to fly the airplane too if you can. If you're flying with an instructor, hand over to them. They should be checking that you're all right as well, and that. But yeah, you wouldn't want to be out there too long on hyperventilation. And if, let's say, you've had an argument on the airfield, or if there's been something major that's happened, please don't get into the airplane and fly. Occasionally I've seen people get close to doing that, and it's not a good place to be, and we are very much entitled to refuse a launch if we think somebody's a little bit worked up or needs to calm down, because we don't really want to be writing accident reports about it. But that's hyperventilation. Diving, another nice diagram from my friend Ben. I don't know if any of you actually go diving in this group, just looking at, but I certainly am not somebody who's done any more than sort of not scuba diving, just sort of snorkeling, sorry. But there's things we do have to think about because of the bends. We were speaking about the nitrogen earlier, and how the fact of the amount in your bloodstream, and how that if you come up too quickly, or actually even if you descend too quickly, you can get this, but it's more of an issue with diving. So if you have been on holiday, let's say in the UK, because you wouldn't actually be able to fly back from Europe if you had been diving 12 hours, 24 hours before. But if you've been diving maybe off the coast and you've only been to 25 feet, then you need to spend 12 hours without flying. More importantly, if you've been below that, if you've been properly deep diving, you need to leave even more time. And I imagine those people that are doing serious amount of diving would already know that. They know that they have to sort of come up in stages. But because obviously you're then going to come with us flying, it's going to change the amount of, it's going to mean that you could get the bends again. And we'll look at what that might cause. Next slide, there we go. As I said, because the nitrogen is absorbed into the blood and you get to these bubbles, it can start to cause some pretty nasty effects that are quite painful and life-threatening. It's just a case of just keep your distance between diving and flying. They're both very enjoyable activities, but I wouldn't want to do either in succession particularly quickly. So yeah, barotrauma. I've had this a couple of times. It's when the acoustion tube, and we're going to look a bit more in the ear, the acoustion tube is sort of within the ear, and it also sort of links into your nose. It sort of balances the pressure out between the ear and the outside world. And it also links between the inner ear and the back of the throat. And if you get a differential between it, we've all had a sort of ear infection before, I'm sure, where you feel like you can't hear very well, or maybe you've been up in an air on a commercial flight and you get that horrible descent feeling when the ear is hurting. This is not particularly good, because you might actually rupture your eardrum, especially if you think of how quickly a winch launch happens. Unless you're flying fighter jets, there's no quicker acceleration vertically, 3,000 to 4,000 feet a minute, than doing a winch launch. So going up flying potentially with blocked ears or blocked sinuses is not a very good idea, and will cause you a lot of pain, and again may mean you're not able to fly the airplane. You can see a similarity with everything here. It's all about being able to make sure you're okay, but that you can actually continue doing your job of being a pilot. If you do get into this situation, then you've just got to do everything really slowly, and you'll be very unlucky to get this linked in with hypoxia, because, as it says, you can't descend very quickly with it, so you'll be stuck between a rock and a hard place. And again, it just explains why we are very clear: do not go flying with a cold. Because you'll pass it on to somebody. I'm sure I picked up at least one cold or two from students, and obviously with COVID at the moment, anything suspicious is going to get picked up by people. So yeah, barotrauma, don't fly with blocked sinuses or blocked eardrums. It's not going to be good for you. Carbon monoxide poisoning. Not particularly relevant to gliders as such, because we don't have an engine. Where's the carbon monoxide going to potentially come from, unless you've got a cockpit fire or something like that, and you might notice it. But if there's an issue with the exhaust system, potentially on a self-launching glider, we've got a few on site, or potentially you've gone flying in the Falk. I know of somebody who's had carbon monoxide poisoning in a gliding aircraft, a tug before. Again, it's the issue with this is that it's very hard to detect because you can't smell it, you can't see it, and you're not necessarily aware that there's even been a fire or there's been some issue with the exhaust system, because some of the exhaust systems on these are quite difficult to see. So if that exhaust air is somehow getting into the cabin, you may get carbon monoxide presence. And we've got these detectors which must be fitted in the aeroplanes, which have a black spot that changes if carbon monoxide is detected. It's pretty much the only way. Obviously at home you've probably got carbon monoxide detectors if you've got a gas fire or something like that. But carbon monoxide, not particularly good for the bloodstream, because you'll potentially die of it, because it will take up all the space that the oxygen needs to go in. Excellent. Hypothermia. Again, wave soaring. You can see that wave soaring is quite a risky thing, actually, if not done properly. In the environments that we're operating the gliders in, we've not got the luxury of having an airliner which is pressurized or has got a cabin heater or anything like that. You're relying on putting good amounts of socks and coats and making sure the glider is well sealed before going flying. There's been occasions where people have been up to sort of 24,000 feet and it's been like minus 20, minus 25, minus 30 outside. It could be pretty chilly. And although the inside of the glider would be warmer and hopefully you'll get some effect of the sun heating the canopy, which will make the cockpit warmer, your feet, unless you're flying a DG built glider, are going to freeze. So what do we recommend when you're going to go flying up in wave? Well, when I went to Aboyne, I brought 2 pairs of shoes. So just before I went flying, I changed the pair, because if you've been walking around on a wet airfield, as Scotland is quite often, that wetness will probably sink into your shoes potentially, or at least make the shoe quite cold. And as a result, you go flying and you go up, your feet are already just a tad wet, it's going to get very cold. So make sure you've got thick socks, a change of shoes for when you get in the glider, and making sure that you've got a sort of a scarf and and a hat, because of course most of the heat is radiator in the head. So yeah, it's quite tricky to fit into the gliders with all this kit, but you certainly won't regret it when you get up high. It can be at Aboyne, like it was in October, it's 13, 14 degrees on the ground. You think, why am I wearing an Antarctic survival suit? But if you're going to go to minus 30, you'll know why. But hypothermia, if you are not adequately dressed, once again, we could get into a dangerous situation. And again, we don't want this all mixing of hypoxia. The first thing, you'll be probably drowsy. You won't be able to do your job properly of flying the airplane, and you won't be able to necessarily operate the air brakes or operate the airplane at high speed, because you might feel a bit weaker. You might get some discoloration in your face, but we don't have mirrors in the gliders and the instructor can't see you, so they won't necessarily notice that. And to do a task, you might find it very, very difficult, and you might start shivering and stuff like that. So my main thing of hypothermia is make sure that you are correctly dressed, because the body is not very good at making its own heat when it's cold at minus 30 sat in a glider, and the body wasn't really designed for that. So the eye. Okay, so obviously our most useful thing, we talk about FLARM being useful, but for a lot of what we do, we still need Mark 1 eyeball to be our very much a right-hand man to do the job of lookouts. And as you can see, the light enters the eye through the cornea. Oh, I've got my the drawing thing. I don't think I can get rid of that. Let's erase all link on the slide. Get my highlighter again. Laser pointer, that's it. I've got 2. Don't know. Try that again. Apologies. Okay, don't know why I've got 2 at the moment, but yes, so I'll get the other pen up because that was working easier. Okay, so we can see that the The light enters through here, and that lens overlies the pupil. And as that comes in, there's the lens, which is inside. And then there's the very complex structure which focuses the light back on the back of the retina. The retina then obviously converts the light into signals, which then go to the brain. So why is this important to us? Well, when we're operating at high altitude or even at moderate altitudes, spending all day in the sun, sunglasses are required because we need to protect any UV damage that we might get done to the eyes. May cause you to need to wear glasses earlier, and certainly if you're looking at white clouds with the sunshine beating down on it, you might get very much blinded by the eye as effects. But the eye, again, was not really designed to go flying, and it has its limitations. Obviously, as a predator, we have eyes on the front rather than having eyes on the side like a let's say a pigeon or another sort of smaller animal does. But the clarity of our eyes can be affected by the amount of light, background contrast, and even the motion of objects. And then the eye can see a lot of different things. We're going to look at a couple of illusions that we might get with the eye, which may make our job flying a little bit harder, especially when it comes to looking at approach angles. It can also lead to a slight blind spot. Like with anything, you won't see absolutely everything, and this is why we make sure that your head generally should always be on the move while looking out, especially with how busy Lasham is, because it's very easy to just focus on one particular area and really just miss out things. Peripheral vision is actually very useful to spot things coming left to right, and certainly when I've seen things a bit closer than I wanted to, it's been the peripheral vision which is easiest to determine that. But yeah, a bit of blind spots that the eye does have is a bit of a problem for us. And if we're just relaxing, we almost might as well have our eyes closed, because your relaxed focusing distance is only a couple of meters in front, which means you will not see anything. And given if you're on a head-on collision with something, at the time, especially if it's a fast jet or something like that, can be very, very short to do anything. And we'll look at an example of that right now. A collision scenario. This also has something to do with reaction times, which obviously reduce if you get things like hypoxia, hypothermia, and stuff like that. And we always need to be on our guard, ready to react to a potential threat, because as much as we might have an air traffic service, as much as we might have FLARM, the threats that might be out there might not be noticed until very late. So you can see the amount of time that we have really isn't long when you consider it takes potentially 5 seconds or so for something to really happen. You can be in a bit of denial of, oh, is that airplane coming towards me or is it going away? We'll look at one of those in a moment, but especially if you're north of Basingstoke and you weren't aware a jet movement was coming, that's going to get you pretty quickly. So yeah, 7.5 seconds from the beginning of seeing something that's out there to responding, and you might only have about 10-15 seconds to at best to avoid a collision. Thankfully, gliders are going quite slow, so the collisions generally are not quick, but we obviously operate around Lasham in a very busy bit of airspace, which can have anything from a balloon all the way up to potentially fast jets. For example, the Red Arrows are due through tomorrow from Brize Norton to do a flight past up in London with the Patrouille de France. That's all just happening in Class G airspace. There's a NOTAM out, but I mean, if somebody doesn't read the NOTAMs, you've suddenly got 18 fast jets on you. So collision scenarios and reducing the time that you have to react is really important. And the best way to do that is keep a good lookout. So the illusions that you might have when you're flying. So narrow runways. So obviously at Lasham we've got quite a big one, but if you go to somewhere like Shoreham, for example, Shoreham's runway is not particularly wide. Or trying to think of another one. If you go to any sort of light GA airfield that has a slightly smaller runway, think Enstone's got a fairly narrow runway, or Denbigh, or Aboyne, actually, thinking of that. If we go on our Aboyne expedition, it's barely bigger than a single road track Aboyne is. So compared to Lasham, looking at how the runway is really does make it a bit different, and that could cause you to land a bit too far down, and also round out a little bit too late because you'll think you're too high. A wide runway, it's closed at the moment, but Manston is quite a wide runway out in Kent. You might actually think when you're approaching from quite far away that you're lower than you actually are, and you might round out a little bit too early. So yeah, don't get confused by that. And we're obviously looking quite a lot of time at these angles and stuff when we're doing circuit planning, because we don't rely on the altimeter. We're landing in a field because we don't know how high the field is, or potentially coming back from a cross-country flight. If we're somewhere out near Andover, quite easily we can see Lasham on a good day, and being able to judge how likely you to get in the airfield is quite difficult. And actually, with Lasham being quite a wide, big airfield, most of the time you'll think, oh God, Lasham looks a long way away. I must be really low. Actually, because of how big the airfield is, you're actually a little bit higher than you think. But with the up and down slopes, you can get to a situation where you don't quite land properly, because we're used to, at Lasham especially, unless any of you have been at Dunstable, used to landing on a flat slope. But if you're landing on a upslope, potentially up near Kingsclear, it gets a bit hilly. If you're up in the Welsh mountains and stuff like that, you might not have enough roundouts because you're not looking at what the shape of the ground is. And the slope from height is actually quite difficult to see until you get to about 500 feet, where maybe you're a bit focused on landing. The other thing to think of on an upslope is quite often you will not bring enough speed. If you're used to landing on a downslope, on a flat slope, you will not carry enough speed because you're used to just leveling with the ground and holding off. If you've got to rotate to an extra maybe 5 to 10 degrees up, the glider might stall during that process and you might hit the ground quite hard nose first. So we brief this on Silver Distance, especially to make sure that people are aware of the slopes, and if in doubt, just carry a little bit of extra speed, because you really shouldn't be landing down slope in a glider if you can help it, unless you're landing at a specific airfield. If you're landing in a downslope field, it's a recipe for disaster, because you might just continue rolling on and hit the fence. So, but there is there's a potential that you might round out a little bit too much and miss the runway almost entirely, or stall a little bit higher. But illusions are quite something we need to be careful. The eye is not particularly good at seeing it. For example, like that, is the glider coming to you or away from you? Quite difficult to see. It's silhouettes. Nice photo though, but yeah, you can't really tell, and people say, oh, it's one way or the other. Actually, I don't even think the author particularly knows. So, illusions. Also, you might get glare. I'll bring up my notes on this. As we were talking about earlier, with high intensity light from all angles, you might get a whiteout scenario. So if you're sitting on top of a cloud with, or going mountain soaring in Spain or something like that, you need to be able to have the relevant eye protection to make sure you're not going to get dazzled by the sun. The eye is obviously protected by eyelashes and blinking and the brow and everything like that, but it's not designed to be able to deal with pure white light. Make sure that if you are going to use sunglasses, that you get the right ones. Do not get polarizing sunglasses, because polarization may mean you might not be able to read the dials in the airplane, because they might polarize out some of the frequency that you're looking for. So if you're trying to look at the vario, if you're trying to look at the radio, generally not a good idea to wear polarized glasses. Might mean you have to spend a little bit more, but yeah, it sucks when you can't see the instruments properly that are electric. generally a green, or I use generally a dark sort of brown tint, which works. You can also pick out with sunglasses better the cloud definition, especially on a blue day where if the light's too intense, the sunglasses off, you won't see the haze cap that's come through the inversion. You won't necessarily see that speck of moisture which is condensed briefly into a cloud. So make sure you've got the right kit, and make sure that you keep yourself safe from high intensity light. Okay, back to the slide. Cloud flying, a little bit of text on this one, but we're going to come on to the ear shortly. But as we do, cloud flying is something which is not done so much in the UK. Back in the 1960s and whatever, with Derek Piggott, he would have climbed up in a T-21 all the way to 25,000 feet in one of these cumulonimbus clouds. I mean, it seems insane, but it was done. Airspace, well, that just wasn't worried about. You just didn't bash into the airliners. But in this day and age, because we're flying much slipperier and have much more sort of advanced sailplanes than those that were just traveling about 40 knots, we don't really have so much room of maneuver to operate without some formal training or idea of how the cloud works, of how the sensors work in the cloud. Quite quickly, within maybe even 15 seconds of entering a cloud, if you've not got instruments to work on, you will start losing your orientation. You may very well lose it before that. You may very well spend a minute in it, but it's quite, you don't really want to try it without the instruments, and make sure you've got the right electrical things on as well. We'll talk about what instruments to use in a moment, but the body is using its senses within the ear to work out whether it's level or not. And you can have a go with this when you go flying one day, to close your eyes and let the instructor bank the glider. It's very interesting to see how the body reacts. Sometimes you think you're in a turn, but actually you're level. And it's quite scary. The body needs vision. It's not used to working with nothing. So the alternative is to use instruments. So to fly in clouds, you really should have, well, and it's not really, you should have formal training. Some of you might have an instrument rating that you've either got through your professional flying or potentially do a bit of private flying. We use that to sign people off, or there's the sailplane cloud flying rating, which the British fought very hard for in EASA regulation to get through to allow us to continue flying in clouds. It's not something we do every day. Today, somebody might have, if they were trying to get slightly above the some of the showers that were around, and if you got into a cloud that hadn't fully matured yet and started to become a thunderstorm. But if you're going to go into cloud, use the correct instrumentation. Now, that might be to just use a turn and slip. I wouldn't recommend that though. Use an artificial horizon. You've got to make sure that you've got as much information as possible to feed the brain, to tell your brain that this is what's right, and you've got to have the trust in the instruments that they are working, they're not slightly dodgy. When somebody does find that there's an issue with the instrumentation, they need to come to us. We need to fix it before somebody goes off flying into a cloud thinking the instruments are working when they're not. The rules mean you should wear a parachute and you should know how to use it. You should not be really doing it within 5 miles of a gliding site because, well, there's lots of gliders around and they don't really want you dropping out the bottom of the cloud. That does mean that we need to stay out of the wispies as well. So by that, I mean, do not sit at cloud base, just popping in and out of cloud. It's colloquially known as the moronosphere because only morons fly through it, because if you're sat at cloud base, you really cannot see if somebody's coming the other way, and at Lasham, more than anywhere else, there will probably be. You really shouldn't be cloud flying either within a known area of an instrument approach procedure. So let's say Oxford, for example, who have been looking for airspace, it doesn't do the cause much help if gliders are flying on parts of their routes in and out of the airport, because if you're not showing up on radar, they won't know you're there, and you might have a Seneca, an Embraer or something like that come through you, and that will not look particularly pretty. You need to announce your intention. I'm not too sure if that, I think it's crossed that out. I think it's actually another frequency. But I'll have to double check. It might be 505, but 405. I get confused because the frequencies keep changing. but make sure you call on the cloud flying frequency before going into the cloud. If you want to remind yourself of stuff to do with radios, double check my last presentation or drop me an email. But you need to say that you're going in cloud to the gliders, but actually it's actually quite worth telling the local radar unit, if you're going to climb in a cloud near Oxford, tell them that you're going to do it. At least they might decide not to route an aircraft too close to you, and really make sure you've got a transponder or a FLARM, then somebody can at least maybe see you. If the instruments fail during this exercise, then you need to get the aircraft stable again. The best way to do that is to make sure that you select full air brake. Some gliders are not certified to fly in cloud, and a very good one is the original Geodiscus. It's not certified for aerobatics either. It's not because the aircraft isn't strong enough. It's to do with the fact that in a 40 degree dive, oh, hang on, here we go. Somebody, yeah, thanks, Serena. Yeah, 1-3. Actually, I'll double check. I'll just double check the that's what the cloud flying frequency is. Just stand by. I've just paused your screen. Cloud 130535. Okay, that's fine. We'll resume the share. 130535 is the cloud flying frequency. So I was just a couple of digits out. But yeah, if your instruments fail during a cloud flying exercise, select full air brake and let the glider stabilize. As I said, with the Geodiscus, it's not certified for aerobatics or cloud flying because of the fact that if you go in a more, I think it's 30 degree or 40 degree dive, and you select full air brake, it will not stop the glider going through V&E using the air brake. So gliders are certified based off how good the air brakes are, as one of the big ways of testing. So the K13, for example, you can almost sit on its nose and it will be able to not exceed V&E because it's a shed. But the slipperier things are not allowed to go in cloud because you want to be able to select full air brake and let go of the glider. Sometimes you can, in a if you know you're going to descend through cloud and the instrument's already failed, what you can do is you put the glider into a turn, trim the glider out and let it do a controlled spiral with the air brakes out. You need to sort of cross your arms to let it do it. Don't mess around with the stick. As soon as you intervene, the airplane will start to build speed and lose control. It's a favourite saying of mine that the airplane knows how to fly and we don't. So yeah, don't try to over control an airplane when you're in cloud. So the ear, okay, so the ear collects sounds and directs them along the ear canal to the ear drum. Those sounds cause the drum to vibrate because there's small fluctuations in the air pressure. And as I say, for the drum to work properly, we need to make sure that the ear is properly equalized. Now, there's various ways you can do this. You can do the Vallasuva maneuver by sort of pinching your nose. You can yawn, you can have sweets, you can do various things to make sure. But yeah, the acoustian tube, which links the back of the throat to the ear, must make sure that the middle ear is at the same pressure, and that's what that pipe is basically there to do. Quite clever. The inner ear also contains organs for balancing and hearing and associated nerve endings. So when we're talking about cloud flying, if you're in a turn, there's fluid that moves about and it knows whether you're it sort of gives you a perception of if you're falling over or not. The semicircular canals give that sort of accelerometer feeling, so the body knows if it's going through acceleration, roll, pitch, yaw, etc. And as we said earlier, you can get a lot of pain if there's a difference between the pressure inside the ear and from the outside world. So make sure that you've got a nicely pressurized ear, and it's at the same pressure with everything else. Right, what else? As we were just talking about, the changes in altitude that could happen. Aerotitus, that's a good word. This is mostly stuff we covered earlier. But yeah, if you're going to sort of fly over cold, don't, because it may damage your ear. Motion sickness, some people say, is fake news, but it is a real thing. If your ear is telling you one thing, if your brain's telling you another thing, and if your vision's telling you one other thing, the body will start feeling ill. That's mostly because the body, in normal circumstances, when it's overcome by its senses, thinks, must be the food, let's get rid of it. So that's why we get nausea. We spoke about cloud and the fact that spatial disorientation, if the turn is slow, you might fail to notice the change. So we said earlier, flight instruments will overcome those issues. Yeah. Again, if you want to avoid motion sickness, if you're taking passengers up one day, fly the glider smoothly. Don't try and do aerobatics on your first go. We don't do that on trial lessons. Avoid turbulence. Well, that's a bit difficult in a glider. We like turbulence because that means we get to go up. But ventilation, I said, use the air scoop. Look at the horizon. Don't just look down at the ground, but look at the horizon as well. Do not spend all your time looking through a camera. When I was a basic instructor, that used to be the thing that used to get people ill, was messing with their GoPro or taking photos. Great thing to have, but actually sometimes it's better for the instructor to be doing it or setting it up. If somebody gets ill, then land as soon as possible, because guess what? You're going to be cleaning the glider up otherwise, unless you've got a nice bag. Some people even use soaring hats for that purpose, but you can't really use them again after that. And the K13, a few years ago, the K13s used to have this sort of very unique smell. Some of them still do. That's the detergent that was being used in them at the time. So maybe an urban myth, but yeah, don't be sick. It's one of my pet hates of things to deal with. G loading, if you're doing aerobatics, positive G, obviously all the blood comes away from the heads. Some of the gliders we've got, like the K21, can pull up to 6.5 G, which is actually quite a lot when you consider it's a fairly basic sailplane. When I have pulled that, if you do it really quickly and you don't tense up against it, you can very easily get sort of like a thinning of the vision. It's quite, I wouldn't say cool, but it's quite interesting to see. You could become blind or get G-lock, G-loss of consciousness. Unlikely in a glider, because we can't really sustain high G for that long. I mean, I know, I think Richard, no, it's one of the other Richards. I don't think it's in this one today, but I know there's a Richard McKinley, one of our members, I think used to fly fast jets, and he's told me about the fact of G loss of consciousness and things like that. But yes, and ultimately you could become unconscious, and that could mean an accident. Similar happened to, unfortunately, the Red Arrows at Bournemouth about 10 years ago. So yeah, make sure that you're not going to pull G unless you're ready for it, and certainly don't surprise somebody with it on their first flight. They generally will pass out. Negative G, if you're doing inverted manoeuvres. Matt, one of our who flies the K21 and also flies the Fox out of Lasham, loves aerobatic manoeuvres, and he said to me last year, I want to get to -4G. I decided to go with him for some ridiculous reason, and he tried. He only got to -3.5, and it nearly blew my head off. It felt awful. Just all the blood sort of rushing to your head. Positive G is much better than negative G. It's this awful thing that sort of red specks. It feels like your eye is bleeding. So really nasty stuff. Yeah, you'll only see negative G if you do a very, very violent cable brake recovery, or you're doing something like an outside loop where you're sort of pushing around instead of pulling around. So yeah, not particularly nice stuff. Psychology, a lot of things can affect. Obviously, flying uses up mental capacity, and at the beginning of your flying career, your saturation points is not very high. If you think about it, if you give somebody who's done 3 winch launches, done the whole launch 3 times, give them a launch failure, they're not going to be able to deal with it, A, because they haven't been trained, and even if they had, they're going to need time to get used to the exercise. So we need to always reduce the workload. And we can do it in various ways. We can either do it with a systematic approach of checklists and DIs and ways of rigging. If we're getting a clearance in air traffic control, we write it down so we can double check, not trying to store too much in our head. we mentally rehearse emergencies, or we practice them via launch failures. We probably don't do as much mental rehearsing of abandoning the aircraft as we probably should. I've had a couple of goes when I was working in Australia, which are interesting. Just need to get away that we don't damage the canopies by doing it. Thinking in advance, decision to land out, engine starts, anything like that. The lower you get, the higher the workload is. So when an easy thing is to have lunch, for example, you're only going to have lunch at the glider when you're up at 4,000 feet. You're not going to do it while scrabbling around at 1,200 feet, avoiding an afternoon in Northampton. Removing distraction. If somebody's coming up to you trying to just have a general chit chat, not very useful when you're trying to do a DI. So there was a very sad accident back in last, not May just gone, but the May before. Standard Cirrus where the tailplane came off. There's been a number of accidents over the years where there's been an issue during the DI process and the whole DI has not been done. If you lose your elevator, you're in big trouble, and a lot of those accidents are fatal. So remove distraction. If you're doing your checks, if you're doing your DIs, don't get involved in needless chit chat. And for example, one way to reduce that is come and do the flight log. Little bugbear of mine, come and do the flight log before you go flying. Just make it easier for the launch controller. As we go into the next few months, there's not going to be many people hang around at the launch point. So we're going to need people to be a little bit more pragmatic with that, and just remembering to come to to tell me about your details before you go flying. Obviously, being able to speak out if you're not happy about something. You might be flying with Colin or I. At the end of the day, we're only human. We might have not spotted the fact that there's an airliner coming your way, or there's something going on. There's been a couple of times when the students spotted something and I haven't, and you can't assume that even us very experienced glider pilots have seen everything. So there's got to be a good atmosphere in the cockpit where you can say anything. We're going to look at the personal attitudes and behaviours, but yeah, and you can see those stresses that we spoke about right at the beginning of the presentation that we need to avoid as well. Fatigue, make sure you sleep enough. I said, yeah, it's normally about double the amount of, so 8 hours sleep provides you 16 hours of activity. So if you double the sleep you've had, that's what you can do. Really, that's at a very much maximum though, and you consider how much workload a glider pilot has throughout the whole day. You can feel absolutely zonked at the end of even a 50-kilometer flight. Your first one, you're going to feel tired, even worse on a 5-hour flight. Yeah, you can sort of see there's lots of different issues. Obviously, very obvious. Anybody who's driven when tired, I have, and it's not very nice. It's quite scary. So yeah, make sure that you are well rested. And especially with online briefings now, you don't have to come to the airfield necessarily for 9:30. You can come along at 10:15. You can. I'm told a lot of you watch my briefings from bed. One person apparently watched it from the loo. So you can watch the briefings anywhere or watch them afterwards. I put them up on YouTube. So we are trying to help with the fatigue. Over to you for the rest of that. Psychology. I've gone through a period of red mist, I think, before. Not probably quite as scary as it's sometimes made out. But for example, what was it, last August, there was a report of a glider crash out near Basingstoke, Nimbus 4 that had come down, and we didn't really know what happened. We just heard the glider was in 2 bits. They needed somebody to get there in an airplane to look at what had happened, and of course I put my hand up and said, right, I'll go and do it. Problem is that when you get into that red mist situation, all you can think about is, right, I need to get there. There'd been other psychological issues just before that, because the day before, which is actually my birthday, there had been a serious accident up on Crossfell with a mate of mine who almost died. So you can imagine that there'd been an accident the day before somewhere else in the country, and now there'd been an accident at Lasham. And because Colin and I write the accident reports and have to deal with sort of the potential fallout of an accident that happens, it's very much feels the need of urgency to get there. So what mistake did I make? Well, it wasn't a particularly bad one, but I didn't put the mixture in before starting the engine. And I tried twice to start the engine without the mixture. So the engine doesn't start. and I look like a complete wally for not following the start checklists. So make sure that you're in the right frame of mind, especially if something unusual has happened. So that certainly woke me up to that ability, and don't just push on. So on a day like today with thunderstorms, don't just think I can get through that shower. Maybe take a diversion around the shower, or just avoid a land out. You don't really want to get struck by lightning, nor do you want to have to land in the middle of a downpour. So yeah, make sure that red mist does not affect you, because it did me. Mindsets and behaviours. We're getting to the end of it now, so hopefully I haven't bored you to death. There's a few sort of standard ones, sort of the Top Gun styles. Sort of anti-authority. I don't have to follow the rules. So yes, the rules on beat ups do apply to everybody. Don't think that beating up the clubhouse just because it's a Tuesday afternoon and I'm around and Colin's not doesn't mean you can just beat up the clubhouse. The rules are there for a reason. Impulsiveness, doing it now. So if there's been an issue with the winch, or maybe you've been late onto the grid and not checking things, do make sure that you've done what you need to do. Invulnerability, potentially you've gone, oh well, there's thunderstorms forecast today, but don't worry about it. Gliders don't get struck by lightning. Well, we know they do, and there's been nearly fatal accidents to that as well. Showing off, doing aerobatics low, not a particularly good way to have longevity. You might win a Darwin Award, and you might get us writing accident reports. And resignation, sort of, who cares? Potentially you've done a checklist 1,000 times, and you think, well, why does that matter? Why does it matter that the air brake? I'm trying to think of a better situation actually. Sort of maybe here's one. Sometimes people are like, oh well, we don't need to do positive checks. The glider was rigged yesterday, and I was the only one who flew it. Oh, nobody cares about it. Nobody checks. Jordan won't double check. Well, again, if you get to the top of the launch and your aileron disconnects, it'll be you who has to deal with the problem, not me. Resignation can almost be as well that you just give up. So potentially you just accept that a situation is particularly bad, which may not be a good way. Glider pilots need to have a realist, slightly optimist view on things. Nearly there. So sort of substances, smoking, obviously if you smoke a lot, you increase the chance of hypoxia due to production of carbon monoxide, which passes passage of oxygen. So if you're operating low level, no problem. Smoking won't do too much. But if you've had 20 just for your wave flight, it's not going to do particularly good. Alcohol, some people say 8 hours a bottle of the throttle, and it's beautiful that the bar is open again. But there's a reason the bar is only open in the evenings mostly, or late afternoon, and that's to stop people drinking before going flying, hopefully, unless you're on an evening group, and then you need to use a bit more sensibility. With alcohol as well, you have to remember it's not just flying which you could get caught up by the law. If you're operating launching machinery such as a winch, you still need to be legal. So yeah, do make sure that you are not going to get caught out. After a heavy night out, despite being 22, I don't go out every weekend, otherwise I wouldn't be able to do my job properly. But if you've had a heavy night out and you've maybe been on a few beers, then maybe you might need closer to 24 hours. It's only 1 hour per unit, and it's 20 micrograms per 100 ml of blood, which is the legal limit. Barely anything is a quarter of the drink drive limit. You might think, oh, well, when do we get breathalyzed? Well, in my career, I've seen one time where the breathalyzers come out, and that was actually in Australia, where they just turned up for random inspection. It could do the same in the UK. Issue is, it's more likely to happen if you have an accident. They might do a toxicology report. Quite often, if you land out in a field and a police car turns up, they'll breathalyze you just because that's what they need to do, and it just makes them feel happier. So you could be breathalyzed at any time, and you could be done not just by the club for getting in trouble, but done by the law as well. Drowsy and illegal drugs, why shouldn't we have to really, it's quite clear, if you've been on the magic mushrooms and the brownies, it's not really going to do particularly well if you then go flying the day after. Again, if there's a toxicology report, it will be brought up, and your insurance might not pay out if there's an accident. Drowsy drugs, if it says do not operate machinery, do not operate machinery with these drugs, because again, you could get some of the symptoms mentioned earlier. Almost at the end, crew resource management does apply to a lot of things now on the airfield. Always make sure we know who's in charge of the airplane, not getting that one confused. If Colin and I are flying together, normally as CFI, I would give it to him, but if I'm in command, then that position is respected. Make sure you just nominate who it is. The flying rules do apply to all, does apply to us staff as well, and just to voice any concerns you might have, because you might not have seen something. CRM issues are a big contributor to accidents. Big famous one, of course, was Staines Air disaster many years ago. How many years ago was that, Dad? 1972. See, I said Dad, having grown up near Heathrow, would definitely remember that.
June 1972, coming up to the anniversary, was just.
Oh right, yeah. So that was a CRM incident because the captain was very experienced and I think was slightly anti-union, and the pilots, the rest of the flight deck, the first officer and flight engineer were both union representatives and quite less experienced. So there was argument before they went flying, and then there was talk it was linked with a heart attack as well and a deep stall, but there was a huge amount going on there, and there wasn't enough speaking up going on in the cockpit. So yeah, CRM issues are a big contributor to accidents. Don't become a statistic. And threat management, we talk about, I think this is the final slide. I'll just double check. Apologies that this has gone on. Yes, it is the final slide. When we're flying, we need to look at threat and error management. It comes into the instructing syllabus now, looking and identifying if we're flying on a mountain site that we've got enough speed, if we're going to operate in a busy area of the country, that we're looking out enough. If we're going to operate in different conditions, making sure that recency is not become an issue. And we're using threat and error management a lot at the moment to decide how we're operating at Lasham. So I know a lot of you, and we're going to come on to a quick update at the end of what's happening at Lasham, are wondering when winching's coming back. Well, winching is statistically more dangerous than aero towing. So we wanted to start with to get people current on aero towing so they get used to the rest of the flying. Then we can reintroduce the launch method of winching, which is more dangerous. And that is an example of threat and error management. It's also how we decided who can and cannot fly. It's not something that's personal or something that we don't like the person. It's just we have to follow what's sensible to keep people safe. So yeah, threat and error management, planning what's going to happen on the flights. Maybe we've got a crosswind today, maybe there's a low sun, just thinking just before going flying, what's changed. I'm not a particular fan of people saying eventuality is the same as before when we go flying, because the wind does change. In half an hour, a sea breeze front might come in and we got a southwesterly wind all of a sudden. So yeah, just make sure that you're always alert and checking your threats. And another mitigation might be a heavy landing. Mitigation is to use the energy absorbing foam that stops you back. Obviously, to avoid heavy landing, you have training or get the landings right first time. Right, a lot covered there. Apologies, is not the most interesting subject. It's not my strongest one, but we will finish up there. I'll just get the thing to mention, shout out for Airability on Saturday the 20th from 2 till 6, who are having their armchair air show, obviously with the Fairford Air Show cancelled, Farnborough and whatnot, and most aviation activity at a very minimal level. There's other ways that that can be sort of aviation can be enjoyed, highlights from over the years, and the Airability armchair air show is a fantastic way to do it. Airability, for those who don't know, it was actually sort of has roots at Lasham. The British Disabled Flying Association used to be based with us with their PA28, and they aim to get people of various conditions flying Obviously, we've got our K21 with a modification which allows you to go flying if you cannot use your legs. But Air Ability can do so much more than necessarily we can, and they're based just up the road at Blackbush and have a huge amount of support. And we donate a trial lesson each year into the big raffle they do, and we're good friends with them. And I know Werner, who was the previous general manager, it has a lot to do with them too, as well as Graham Garnett. So do join them for that. Put in a donation too if you can. And yes, so that's it of that presentation. Just to keep you up to date with what's going on at Lasham. So at the moment, we've been aerotowing and just private member flying, plus people have been using the club gliders. We're expecting the Department for Transport to issue new guidance, hopefully around the 4th of July, to allow some form of instruction. It's not going to be business as normal, but it will allow some alleviation to the situation at the moment. So there's that. We've also got winching, which will be returning a little bit before then, probably end of June, early July. We've got a bit of instructor training happening just before that to get the instructors up to currency so they're ready to deal with the students. But yeah, things are moving apace. Obviously, we cannot do any more than we can at the moment because we are subject to the guidance. But yeah. Patricia asks, is there still 2-week quarantine for entering the UK? Of course, Patricia, I'm afraid at the moment you're in Belgium. It'd be great to see you as soon as possible. Unfortunately, the government does still have quarantine in place. We hope that that will get relaxed into July as well. It's one of those things where it's been decided, let's say, a little bit late to do that policy, but they want to be seen to have done something. So yes, Patricia, that is the case at the moment. There's no way for me to get around that for you, but as soon as there is, I look forward to seeing you on the airfield. So let's hope that changes. And you did say you might get some flying done in the Netherlands. So if you can do that, even better. Okay, I think that's it from me. I will wait to see if there's any other questions, whether it's about the Lasham operation or anything we discussed this evening. So into next week, I'll try and do a question and answer thing on any probable part of the syllabus and how things are going to change as we go into July once we've got an idea. But also, I think it's the 29th, not this Monday, but next Monday. I'm going to let this is the first time this has been announced. We're going to do a question and answer webinar with Mark Turner, who's head of air traffic at 2XL Engineering. So we're going to have a good chat about jet movements, which will cover the syllabus which the pre-solo and white car pilots have to do. So we're going to have a good chat on that for an hour and talk about sort of why things happen on our side, why things happen on their side, and just give you an insight into the interesting world of jet operations at Lasham. So that would be Monday, I believe, at 7, but wait for the email for that, but not this Monday, next Monday. But any other questions? I'll just have a look now. Serena says, oh, great, that's good. I'll try and get some more out for you. Obviously, a day like today has been quite easy because I've been working from home, but continue to use our weather forecasts each day, and we're going to try and encourage that. That won't change even with instructing coming back or even a different change to the 1 metre rule. But we'll try and get some more, maybe one on navigation done at some point. I can't promise exactly when it will be because we can only do these when we've got the spare time. It takes me a few hours to do this, plus some of the other work that I'm doing at the moment on airspace. So other than that, have a fantastic evening. I'll stay on the call for a few more minutes to see if there's any more questions. But I'll hopefully see you on the airfield in the not too distant future. Bye for now. Thanks, Serena. Oh, chat. Thanks, Martin. And hi, Dev. There's a jet movement on Monday, Nev, so come and see that. That's at 9:30 if you're on the airfield before that. Remember, breakfast is available from 8:30, I think it's the moment, or is it 9 o'clock? And Peter, if you want to go up on a Wednesday at all, you're more than welcome to. If you want to sort of help out and see the mates, we would very much encourage that, and hopefully we'll get you flying again soon. Okay, I'll see you on the airfield.